In this podcast episode, Daniel Di Martino, a Venezuelan economist and critic of socialism, shares his firsthand experience and analysis of Venezuela's catastrophic decline under socialist rule. The conversation explores Venezuela's former economic strength, the rise and fall of its democracy, the devastating consequences of socialist policies, and the broader implications for Western countries considering similar ideologies. The episode also delves into issues of corruption, authoritarianism, drug trafficking linked to terrorism, and the refugee crisis, while addressing common misconceptions and the role of foreign influences. Daniel highlights that Venezuela was once one of the richest countries globally, particularly in the 1950s, when it ranked fourth in GDP per capita due to its vast oil reserves and relatively free market economy. It attracted immigrants from Europe and the Middle East seeking opportunities. Up until the 1990s, Venezuela was wealthier than countries like Spain and Italy. The country's initial democratic system allowed economic freedom and growth, but over time, temptations to increase government size grew, fueled by oil wealth. Venezuela nationalized its oil industry in 1976, but reinvestment was minimal and economic stagnation followed, setting the stage for increasing public dissatisfaction. The public frustration with corruption, economic stagnation, and inequality created fertile ground for Hugo Chávez, a charismatic populist, to rise in 1998. Chávez ran on promises to challenge the status quo and implement a democratic socialist agenda. Initially buoyed by rising oil prices during the 2000s, which substantially increased government revenues, his government instead used the funds poorly, resorting to widespread corruption and mismanagement. Chávez undermined democratic institutions by rewriting the constitution, expanding presidential powers, abolishing checks and balances, and centralizing control over states. He aggressively nationalized and expropriated private businesses, destroying Venezuela's productive capacity. Corruption was deeply interwoven with the growth of state power in Venezuela. Daniel explains that corruption thrives in systems where the government controls the economy, as was the case after Chávez's nationalizations. The expansion of government involvement allowed both politicians and military leaders to exploit resources on a vast scale. Notably, valuable assets like the country's gold reserves were seized by government officials and mysteriously disappeared, only to resurface in places like Dubai, infamous as a money laundering hub. High-profile officials who resisted such corruption faced intimidation and imprisonment. The economic decay under socialism was stark. Price controls led to shortages, nationalizations led to bankruptcies, and rampant money printing caused hyperinflation. Venezuela went from a once prosperous nation exporting billions in oil to a country with empty store shelves, rolling blackouts, lack of basic services like water, and severe food scarcity. Daniel emphasizes that these outcomes were not due to sanctions, corruption alone, or external interference, but fundamentally stemmed from the socialist model itself. Government control of means of production combined with economic mismanagement. Daniel stresses that Venezuela's crisis has led to the largest refugee migration on the planet, with about 9 million people, nearly a third of the population, having fled, surpassing displacement numbers from conflicts in Syria and Afghanistan. The refugee wave destabilizes neighboring countries and creates a humanitarian crisis. He contrasts Venezuela with Iran, another authoritarian and sanctioned regime, noting that Iran does not experience comparable refugee flows or hyperinflation, largely because it is not socialist and still allows some economic activity to sustain its population. Chávez and Maduro built strong ties with hostile regimes to the United States, including Cuba, Iran, Russia, and China. Cuba's survival post-Soviet Union depended heavily on subsidized Venezuelan oil, facilitating a symbiotic relationship. Venezuela has become a platform for asymmetric warfare against the West through drug trafficking and support for terrorist-linked groups. Hezbollah training camps reportedly operate on Venezuelan soil, and Colombian guerrilla groups like FARC and ELN find sanctuary with regime protection. China, Russia, and Iran have provided loans and technical support in exchange for influence and political alignment. A central topic is the regime's participation in drug trafficking, referred to as the Cartel of the Suns, involving military generals and the dictator's family. Venezuela acts as a transit hub for cocaine produced mainly in Colombia, facilitating drug smuggling to the United States and Europe. This illicit trade finances the regime, sustains military loyalty, and fuels violence. The podcast discusses U.S. military strikes against drug traffickers' boats in the Caribbean, which Daniel supports as justified actions targeting a regime that perpetuates harm domestically and internationally. Unlike other authoritarian socialist states such as Cuba or China, Venezuela has a unique and severe crime problem. As crime rates soared under Chávez and Maduro, armed gangs and colectivos emerged, often used by the regime to repress protests and intimidate citizens. These groups operate with impunity, control prisons, and contribute to the breakdown of law and order. Daniel explains this as an intentional political strategy to maintain control via violence and fear. The regime exploits migration routes to infiltrate criminal elements into other countries, including the United States. Daniel expresses hope for U.S. military action beyond strikes on drug boats, as he believes only decisive intervention against Maduro and his inner circle will restore democracy and prosperity in Venezuela. He points to historical successes of U.S. interventions in Latin America, such as Panama and Grenada, to argue that targeted operations without large-scale troop deployments could be effective. With a democratic opposition in place and a population largely united against the regime, the context differs from other conflict zones. The conversation closes with a warning to young Westerners attracted to socialist ideas. Daniel cautions that socialism inevitably concentrates power in government hands, which then can be abused regardless of which political party is in control. He explains that private property rights serve as essential protections against overreach by governments one might dislike personally. He encourages addressing issues like housing affordability and economic opportunity through deregulation, reducing professional licensing barriers, and reforming welfare incentives within a capitalist framework, not through socialism, which he views as historically destructive. Daniel briefly touches on the political polarization by gender, observing that young women tend to support far-left parties more than young men, a trend seen in various Western countries. He worries about the consequences this may have on family formation and the political future of the West, but acknowledges this is a complex subject requiring further understanding. Throughout the episode, Daniel shares personal anecdotes about growing up in Venezuela, describing how his family's income plummeted due to inflation, infrastructure failures like electricity and water outages, and the pervasive fear due to crime and repression. He recounts how media censorship forced him to seek information online at a young age. The human toll of the regime's policies adds a poignant dimension to the economic and political analysis.